guys are the important people and the ones we're performing to. The ones who are watching online don't matter at all. Okay? And it would seem that we are live on the interwebs. So, hey, I'm Bill Thompson, and a warm welcome to everyone, online and in the real world, to this event at the International Literature Showcase. So, thank you attendees, thank you audiences online. We're here to discuss digital literatures, and the word literatures is a plural, I think, quite deliberately. My name is Bill Thompson, and I'm a board member of Writer Centre Norwich, one of the host organisations, but also someone who's worked with digital stuff in various capacities for many years. I was on the internet in 1984 when it was only a year old, so I've sort of grown old with it, and my beard has become white as a result. And I'm very pleased that we have three experts, people who really know what they're talking about, to join us here today. Although I am reminded once of being interviewed on a Radio 4's PM radio programme by Eddie Mayer, who introduced me by saying, and with us now is Bill Thompson, who claims to know about this sort of stuff. And we have Tom, Annette and Steve, all of whom claim to know about this sort of stuff, but we may find out whether or not that is the case. Tom Aber, on my far left, lectures at the University of West of England in Bristol. He's a director of circumstance, a book designer, a writer, a storyteller, and he contemplates the relationships between story and platform. Annette Mees makes immersive theatre, interactive experiences, and new forms of adventure, I think. And as part of Coney, she uses what you call clever digital means to tell stories. And then we'll find out more about what those clever digital means might be. And Steve Fowler is a poet, an artist, a martial artist, I understand. So that would explain why you used to work as a doorman in a club in Newcastle when you were younger.
True.
And a vanguardist, working across poetry and fiction, interaction, sonic art, visual art, performance. Basically, if you got it, you'll play with it.
If they'll pay me, I'll do it.
Our panel. So before we start, I want to hand out some props and read something to you. So I'm going to start with the props. I'd like these back when you finished with them, but these are, may I just take one of them? These are postcards. Penguin will sell you 100 postcards in a box, and these are of Penguin Classics. They're the authors. Here's, of course, Camus, looking soulful. One of the questions that emerged when we were talking about this session earlier is whether we'll ever have postcards like this of the artists who are working in the digital sphere, whether we will laud the individual author in the same way, or whether something happens when you go online that somehow dilutes your connection to the creator in a way that a book doesn't, and that's one of the things I want to come back to. And I've also brought you a bit of the future, or rather a bit of the present. This is a mini-me. This is a 3D printed bill. All right? It does many things. It demonstrates you can do a 3D scan. It demonstrates you can print it. It also demonstrates quite conclusively that my bum does look big in this. And again, I'd like to just pass that around. I have others, but do try not to break my legs off because it's a bit like a voodoo thing. I would feel the pain. It would make it quite hard for me to carry on with the session. So enjoy your props while we get on. It's something to distract them. And I do apologise for everyone who's watching on the live stream that you can't have these physical objects. You see, you should have come to Norwich. This is a book called Moomin Papa at Sea by Tove Jansson. And it's a favourite of many, a children's story. Some of you may know of it, some of you may not. But what you really need to know is that the Moomins, trolls, are a close family that have many interesting adventures. And in Moomin Papa at Sea, Moomin Papa, the patriarch of the family, decides to assert himself because the family's living a nice and comfortable life, but he has a dream. He dreams of a lighthouse, a beautiful lighthouse, on an island in the middle of the sea, where he wants to live with the family and look after his family and be self-sufficient and lock himself away from the rest of the world. And so he takes the family on a perilous voyage in their boat across the sea to the lighthouse, and they find the island, it does exist, and they find the lighthouse. And when they get there, in the place by the door where the key should be hanging, there's nothing. They can't get into the lighthouse. They can't find their way into the shining tower of perfection that has drawn them. There's a bit of a metaphor going on here. And so they are stuck. And Moomin Papa wanders around the island trying to find the key to the lighthouse, trying to find the way in. And eventually he starts wandering along a path that he realizes has been worn by the lighthouse keeper. And he walks towards the end of a precipice, a cliff. Moomin Papa went up to the edge and looked over. Here the cliff fell away in precipice after precipice, a mass of playful dancing lines and curves that bent out of sight deep, deep down. Moomin Papa's legs trembled and he felt distinctly giddy. He leaned a little further forward and caught sight of a little ledge just beneath the crest. It seemed quite natural to let oneself slide down to the smooth shelf in the cliff face. It was hollowed out and as round as a chair. Suddenly, Moomin Papa was completely alone and cut off. There was nothing but sky and sea around him. This is where the lighthouse keeper must have sat. He must have sat there often. Moomin Papa pressed his back and his paws against the wall of rock behind him, where he could see that little white flowers were growing in the cracks in the rock. Imagine flowers. And in the widest crack, there was something shining, rust red, a heavy iron key. And Moomin Papa found the key, and the family moved into the lighthouse, and all was well. And when it comes to looking for the key to digital literatures, not only is there no key, there's no lighthouse, no island, no sea, and the Moomins were made up. As we look for the single answer, we will not find it. There are many overlapping narratives and stories to tell. There are many adventurous ways to tell stories, to do things. And what we're going to try to do in the hour and a bit we've got is to explore some of them with three practitioners who are doing the best as they can to map this terrain. And some of them are not doing as well as they might. But we learn from failure. And I suppose what I want to do is start by giving each of you in turn, I think we'll go Tom and then Steve, an opportunity to set out your stall and to talk about the spaces within which you have chosen to fail.
Whoa. Okay. Failure's good. Failure's great. Failure you get to learn from. So, hi. Hello to the room. Hello to the interwebs. Hello to my parents-in-law, if you're watching the live stream. There are three things I want to say, and this is, I'm very aware that I'm addressing the audience in the room because you're writers, you're poets, you're festival makers, you're interested in literature. And these are them. One, an ebook is a parody of a book. It's an imitation. It's a poor facsimile. And it cries itself to sleep every single night because it's not allowed to be a real book. The second thing, Ali Smith, who spoke last night, was astonishing and brilliant. And one of the things she said toward the end of her talk was an anecdote she related via Laurie Anderson about Laurie Anderson being asked, doesn't the technology get in the way? Doesn't all these keyboards and computers sort of obstruct what you do? And Laurie Anderson held up a pencil and said, this is a piece of technology. And I think she's absolutely right, but I want to extend that a little bit. If all your writing so far has been made with a pencil and paper, what happens if I give you a piece of charcoal? Because you'll make the same marks, you'll tell the same stories, you'll use the same language, but you'll make them in a slightly different way, that they're changed by the writing medium. And for me, that's what digital actually is. It's a shift. It's a slightly different way of thinking about what you do, what we all do. And the third thing, and this is my soapbox moment, and I think you do need to hear this. Digital is not choose your own adventure. Choose your own adventure is a mechanical hinge. It's a device. It's a way to get from one piece of action or story or event or decision to another, to impart some responsibility for that scene-to-scene transaction to the reader rather than the author. And when we use it, we take away agency from the author. We deny writers the authority of telling their stories the way they want to. And in my experience, it usually diminishes the story on offer. It's the lowest common denominator. It's an easy way to describe what books look like when they're digital. But personally, that's the wrong question. The really interesting question is, what does digital allow the book to be?
Thank you.
Excellent question. Okay, so I think what's really exciting for me is to be in this context, because I think already, just having been here less than 24 hours, I've met so many people with so much amazing networks and themselves writers of beautiful, beautiful stories. So for me to think about what I do in this context is incredibly exciting, because all of us, no matter how we do it, we tell stories. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is the way that how we relate to each other and to the world and to stories is shifting. The news is different, where you used to gather around the radio and once a day the news came in and everyone had the same news. Now it sort of drips in via Twitter, and that sends you to the BBC News website, which links you through to people on the ground who are showing their live footage on YouTube. And all of these things, stories, how we respond to each other, how we respond to the world is different. I have very close and intimate relationships on the internet. I Skype a lot with my mum, who lives in another country than I am. That's great, that's intimate. I also use Twitter a lot, which is incredibly unintimate and sort of sends these tiny little thoughts into the world, both to me and from me back out. So what's interesting to me is what that means for the stories that we create, literature, created narrative. It means that there are new possibilities, charcoal. There are new ways of thinking about it. So there's two elements to that. One is how we make it, how we create work. And the second bit is how that work then exists. So digital for me is both a platform that has different qualities, different affordances, different things we can do with it, but it's also a communication network, so it allows dialogue to happen quite easily. Dialogue between different writers, dialogue between different ideas, different input, research, as Ali Smith talked about yesterday, can look very different. Exchange of ideas can be part of a creation process. Then there is the distribution process. So that's like, what does a book look like? What can it be? Where can stories live at the moment? So part of that is and should be completely and utterly curated and made and crafted and beautiful, just like every book is. But there is also space for other layers to exist. Things that are dynamic, things that can change. We talked earlier about the 5 versions of Frankenstein that knock about. They can coexist now quite easily and be linked up and found and have space, whereas where dialogue between different pieces of work, different writers, different audiences can take place. So I'm really interested in what this means, how we think about the creation of work, how we think about distribution of work, how we think about the new and exciting ways to tell stories and what that means, how those stories then in turn are in dialogue with the world. Where does literature, where do our stories sit? Who and what are they talking to? And how can we make that even more exciting?
Thank you. And I think the sense that we will continue to tell stories, that they remain at the heart of it, but the ways in which we do it and the way in which they reach people shift is one we will come back to. Steve, can I ask you to...
Of course, it'd be a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Position yourself.
Hello, everybody. Hello. I actually think it's a question of theory. We're talking about something so fundamental that often the language we use to talk about digital technology, whether it be in fiction, poetry, or these kind of art mediums, or in life in general, is really problematic. I think, probably not the people in this room, but I think in our society, in our culture, there's an incredible amount of demonstrative pessimism about technology because of its potentiality, because we're afraid of it. And I think there's a lot of a misnomer about the notion that technology is in the language of utility, i.e. it's a tool. It's not a tool, it's an environment. It's a phenomenology. It's an entire experience of the world. Technology isn't a Kindle. It is medicine evolving to the point where the world population doubles in the last 40 years. It's the ability for neuroscience to dominate the other brain sciences because of technological innovation. Technology is a fundament. So we can't really enter into that world speaking in a language where we're talking in such literal, immediate, prosaic terms. It literally changes the way humans think in the neurological context. And the ability to travel any place in the world or speak to someone within 2 seconds when 100 years ago it would have taken you a month is not something that should then be entered into when talking about Kindles, because literature is about people in the world. It's about people reflecting their environment. So I really only want to speak from the position of poetry because I'm not a technologist, but 2 primary things that have come up technology for me which have really influenced what I do and what I'm interested in. One's structural and one's purely aesthetic. The first one is really, really important to me. I call myself a vanguardist, which is just a literal translation of avant-garde because I'm monolingual. But of that fact, people always look to that and say to me, isn't that a retrograde notion? You're talking about people from the 1920s or whatever. Vanguard is a military term, means you're at the front, you're shot first. You're looking towards the future, you're interested in what the future is. This isn't the responsibility of technologists, nor of writers, of humans. If you're not interested in technology, you are a Luddite. You are being lost. I'm not a technologist, but if you're not interested, if you're not open to it, you're completely lost. And theoretically, the beautiful thing of what technology has done for poetry, for me as someone who's interested in innovative literature, is it's made the dominant strain of poetry in this country especially, and I won't speak to other countries, look like what it is, which is the strange, romantic, theological, poetic language of 100 years ago. This wasn't obvious 20 years ago. Now it hitting people in the face. You can't miss the fact that if someone writes in flowery first-person, identity-reinforcing, narrative, sentimental prose, that they might not be reflecting the language around them. They might be writing the way the people they enjoyed reading who wrote in an attic 100 years ago or were inspired on opium trips. Poetry is not about being inspired by a muse, and it's not about emotion. It's about language. It's about the material of communication. Poetry's ability is to use the medium of communication, that is language, for something that isn't conversation. Poetry should be something that reflects the world. It mulches language. The poet repatriates that language into the world. What is the poetry of data? What is the poetry of algorithms? This is the question of our time, and if we're not answering it, we're talking to the past. Now, technology has done this. It's thrust us into the moment when we need to be innovative in order to relate. And structurally, the history of the printing press is the history of power. You control the press, you control what's printed. And this is something that's vitally important that we don't talk about. And in poetry specifically, presses always pretended that they were market force related. So you buy this guy because he's great, not because I published him with subsidies and you have no choice. The internet has destroyed this. Now people can access any poet at any time and read them, and the market is starting to respond to that. People are starting to get published because they're innovative, because the press can see people are buying them, they're interested in them, because everyone can get to the internet and everyone can self-publish. So technology is about emancipation, it's about communication. It's such a fundamental thing that I do worry sometimes we're too pessimistic and too specific.
Thank you. Thank you all for your very different perspectives. I think the sense that literature may be too literal to deal with the technological storm that is raging is a really fascinating one. And another point that you made, Steve, was about the fact that technology changes our minds, that we are shaped by the technological environment within which we live. And of course, if literature is an expression of our core humanity, then does the fact that the technological environment shifts that humanity mean that literature has already changed? It's just that the guardians of the canon haven't necessarily noticed it yet, that the world that is reflected away from the internet is already out of date just because of the impact of, as you said, mobile phones, of laptops and things like that on the lives of so many people around the world. Obviously, not everybody in the world has access to that technology or access to a smartphone, but for those who do, does that mean literature has already shifted? If you'd like to dive in on that one.
You're looking at me, aren't you?
I was. Only to start with.
Literature has always shifted. The idea of the novel, I'm on a soapbox again, aren't I? The idea of the novel is
This is a soapbox.
This is a soapbox.
We want you on a soapbox.
Stamp on it. The novel's a recent invention. The novel's arguably an invention of the modernist era. It's something that came into existence either with Penguin Books and mass market editions. The idea of the fixed object is 60 or 70 years old. You go back further than that, the novel's a completely different shape. The novel 100 years ago, 200 years ago is a completely different shape. Literature has always evolved. It has always reflected technology and reflected the means of production, the means of distribution, and the means of reception. So I think, yes.
But Steve's implying that there's some sort of block against admitting that the poets are writing in the old language, that the people who are running festivals, the people who are trying to get published, don't actually accept that that is the case.
I think Steve's also arguing...
Well, actually, we should find out what Steve is arguing.
No,
Steve, what are you arguing?
I think that he's also arguing, and when you were speaking, my kind of academic head went, you're a little bit utopian. But I think you're right, that the voices that are not being published in a conventional manner, the voices that don't emerge through, and it's a cliche to talk about gatekeepers, but they do exist. The voices that are emerging from the web, the voices that are emerging from social networks, from media, from a whole, and that doesn't mean I'm just talking about young people, it's a range of writers, emerge because they are reflective of the times in which they're writing. And I think they do exist. So I think, yes, I'm possibly more guarded than Stephen is with the state of things.
I do believe that there's kind of a manifest destiny thing that happens, like how we use, I have equal fears about technology in general, especially technology in literature, but I think the more that we emphasize the potentiality, the better it's going to end up being. I just think that's something that's fundamental. Sorry.
No, you go.
I actually do think it's a completely new moment. I think literature in general has always evolved, like all things do, but there is also many times and places when it simply does not. It actually does have a complete control over a certain view of the world. And many times, I think, especially now in the last 70 years post-war in the UK, there's been a real problematic with the notion of modernism, as though it's some niche, esoteric pursuit on the fringes, because of the dominance of a realist, gratified notion of what art is. And technology is doing something really, really remarkable. It's ignoring the vehicles in which we share these aesthetic ideas and creating new ones. And it's truly a new moment. I mean, I know every generation says that. Every generation says, oh, it's the new, it's the new. Literally, practically, from every element of what we eat, sleep, think, do, interact with, it is changing so powerfully and quickly. And I'm the transition generation. I'm not the new generation. I was born with no computer technology, no ability to write on a computer. I wouldn't have as a baby anyway, but you know what I mean? Yeah. So I do think that this is something that is incredibly exciting if we get hold of it and actually changes the form. It's not about the content. We always talk about writers writing in a certain way without thinking actually what are they doing with the form. It doesn't matter to me. I mean, without sounding like deliberately contradictory, I'm not telling stories with my art. We're not all telling stories. A story is, unless you mean like in a cognitive neurological function of giving information, my work absolutely is not about my identity or me telling you what I've experienced. I think that's the first moment of all art form. The last moment of all art, to me, is revealing the possibilities of communication in new languages. And that's not a story, that's about material. That's about language and what we do in our brains with language. It's not about giving people a comfortable idea that they can enter into, although I do love Toby Jans.
Thank you. And in your work, you're not just engaging with literature, though. You are, in fact, on the other side of engaging with the technology. You're over there, and you should be able to shine a light on the sort of issues that Steve has raised from your own artistic perspective.
So I think I'm just very excited about the possibilities. I think as a consumer of literature and art and theatre and film, I love just being moved. I love having deeply felt experiences. I love experiencing beauty. I love being taken away. I love being confronted with things. I think all of us in the room do. I think what's exciting is that the world is shifting very quickly and we don't understand it, and that's wonderful. I think what I advocate for very strongly, and I think the gatekeepers are shifting. You know, it's all so young, but we're here, we're on this panel in an international literature showcase, talking and thinking about what are the new possibilities, what are the things that we can do as people who make art to move our audiences. And I think, so I'm just really excited by the possibilities and really excited to be here and exploring with writers and people that are so embedded in what storytelling and poetry and literature and all of those forms, what is their place in the world, how do they connect with readers, how do they connect with wider society? And I think that's what these new platforms offer us, is a way to really reinvestigate that and really reinvestigate what it is that we want to do and how we want to tell it. It's full of possibility.
But that requires a certain amount of braveness on the part of those who are currently trying to scrape a living as writers or programming festivals or working with authors, doing all of the things that all of you in the room are doing. If things are changing so substantially, and you all seem to say they are, that it is quite a fundamental shift in the way the wider society is constructed. And from my perspective, I do a radio show each week on BBC World Service Radio where we look at technology around the world. And it's clear, even in countries that have less access to the technology, the availability of those tools is shifting people's lives, is changing people's lives. So it's not just a phenomenon that's limited to developed Western countries, it's something which applies around the world. If that is the case, then there's an enormous risk for those who move forward that they will lose the things that they feel they know how to do and are in control of, and that it will take safe options. You talk about, digital literature is not just a choose-your-own-adventure game, and the Kindle is an example of what I'd call a killing jar for ebooks, where you pin the ebook onto the flat screen and don't allow any forms of interactivity or engagement with it other than the act of reading, so it's as close to the printed book as it can be. Is there a danger that those things will almost derail the revolution and they will become the things we settle for, is digital literature?
It's a bond, I think. Something like the Kindle is a bond. It's a way for people to transition, like myself. I'm not a technologist. The thing is, I think the overall debate is, as I'm sure you agree with, is kind of moot. It's coming. If people want to adapt now or 20 years, you're going to wake up and it's going to be around you. So you can either be in front of it and be interested, or...
I've seen revolutions fail. I'm older than you.
But I think the thing, back to I feel like I'm repeating myself. I think the thing is that there will be stories to be told, art to be experienced, and people who make it and people who want to have access to it, and we'll keep making amazing work. And sometimes it will fail, and sometimes it will be beautiful. But I think everyone wants art to develop with the world. We don't want literature stories to become relics. We don't want literature to be a heritage industry. We want it to be part of life. It's vital that storytelling.
What does that then mean?
Yeah, for me, if it does, then it does. We shouldn't fetishize. I mean, we do this so much. We fetishize things that we're comfortable with because we've been surrounded by it. But things change. It's good. We've come to associate paper with a very certain kind of dominant literature, which is a narrative story. It begins with a certain perspective in the world and it moves through describing details.
Yep.
We've lost the notion that a piece of paper, we've lost even the notion, and again I speak from poetry, that typographical innovation might reveal a meaning. We don't even really think about that as writers in general in our culture. We don't think about the size of the font, the colour of the font, the shape of the page. There is a little bit, but
I'm a book designer. We think about it all the time.
But you know what I mean?
Obsessive.
If we go into Waterstones and we look at the books, we open the books, we see how many have any sort of innovative typography, it will be very, very small.
It's a minority.
It's a tiny minority in terms of what the dominant. So I'm not saying that it doesn't happen, I'm just saying it primarily does. So when you look at the MIT Media Lab and you look at the stuff they're doing with literature and narrative, they're doing things like synesthesia bars, where you get multi-experiential literature programs, where it's actually relating to the way you cognate emotion. So you're talking about light shows that aren't showing you light. They're actually going into your prefrontal cortex and giving you the experience of a story in a medium which is beyond our current language. That is what I'm interested in. Not necessarily because it's going to come next week. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry about that. But no, I just think...
A medium beyond our current language.
Yeah, I just think that's what...
How do you make money out of that?
I'm sure someone will.
Well, that's a really dangerous... It's a really tricky thing to get your head around. I mean, this is... Sorry, this is my long anecdote. Bill, we spoke briefly before lunch about this, and Bill told a story about speaking to television executives about the future of television and walking into the room and saying, you don't have one, and then sitting down. And that's this thing that's often said about publishing, that publishing currently doesn't have a future. Publishing definitely has a future, but publishing in its conventional form the things we're talking about may not appear from conventional publishers. They may not appear from conventional houses. And in a sense, the shift, the opportunity is to create new forms of fiction. The difficulty is, and I'm an academic, so I have to quote Marshall McLuhan, it's in my contract, is that any medium is comprised of the medium that came before it. That we think about digital as embodying somehow the medium that came before. So the easy way of doing this is when film came along, it's recorded theatre. When television comes along, it's film on a small screen. When digital comes along, the thing that was said about the computer is it's the medium that eats every other medium. Now, obviously it does, but that's not what it can do. It can do other things, and it finds its own form, and it finds its own way around things. And I think we are in a transition, and we have always been in a transition, but that's the future bit.
If that's the case, then the three of you have a perspective on the end state, the state after the transition, that will be of value to those who are going on that journey. What are some of the characteristics, if you like, of future literatures that you think will become most important?
So one of the things that I find really interesting, and I don't have a view of the post, what it's going to be at all. If anything, I'm part of sort of a group of explorers trying to figure out where it's all going. I think one of the things that I'm really interested in is looking at the dimensions of the dynamic and the static. The book, by definition, is static. The Kindle is static. It's a thing. Once it's finished, it's finished, and it's there. It was beautifully. Ali Smith talked yesterday about the change. You change, but it stays the same. So it might change meaning. I think that's great. That's crafted. That's made. That's finished. That's an artist's work who's finished something. What digital offers is next to that a dynamic dimension, something that can shift, that can change, that can grow, that can change meaning as time changes meaning. So I'm really interested in the dynamic and the static. And secondly, can I do a second one?
I want to press you on this one first, so hold second. Dynamic does not mean unfinished in your view, though. It is a finished but dynamic work of art, or is it an unfinished work of art that's allowed out into the world to be changed by its audience? Because they are different.
So I feel like the distinction is a wrong one that you're making. I'm very sorry, Mr. Thompson.
That's okay. So you said fail often.
Fail forward.
Fail forward.
So I don't know what this means yet, but I know that when I create work, some of the elements of it are static, and once they are done, they're done.
They're given.
They're given.
Yeah.
That can be during the process or at the end of it. In the creation process, some elements are dynamic. They keep shifting through the input of others. Also, when the thing is finished, so it's me as an author, I'm done, it still is allowed to shift. Certain elements are allowed to shift. Other elements remain static, and the collaboration of those two elements make the finished/unfinished work.
Okay. Thank you. That was nicely done. She has a second point to come to. So,
oh God,
right.
now I need
I'm
to
gonna
go
come
back
back
to
round
my
again.
old
That's the first
train of
point.
thought.
she can't. I'll let Tom into the...
Why don't you, and I'll try and regrow my tone.
I'm partly because I want to reinforce what Annette's just said, but the book is a fixed thing. Literature there is a tyranny to the printed page, but
The words are still the same as they were when I read from it half an hour ago.
But you're not the
Astonishing.
same. But Bill, you're not the same person who read that now as who read it 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and so on. We change. This is the point I was making, that we change. We bring something new to it, and when I read a book is not the same as when my wife reads a book, as when somebody in the street reads a book. And I think that moment, that interactivity, that immersion, that slipperiness is key to writing. It's key to making. For me, one of the things that Circumstance say, I'm quoting Circumstance, is that we allow space for the world to happen. That we do control certain things. We'll control audio. We'll control where you're stood. We know certain things about what you're doing when you experience our work, but there's 90% of that we don't know. And that's the interesting bit, because that's the bit where you get a real kind of a sense of being, a sense of that literature or that body of work existing at that moment, in that time, in that space, which has always been true about books, but it's just more visible. It's more kind of foregrounded.
And it should affect the content as well as the form. And I couldn't agree with you more, but that should really go into the way people choose to write and reflect the world that they're in.
Yeah.
If interactivity is the fundament of the new technology, not the technology as that word as it means, but the potential of digital literatures, then it shouldn't just be that we create these objective stories, these versions of our identity to be in the world, for people to be different, to interact. It should be in the text.
Charles Olson said a very difficult thing, writing about Black Mountain poetry. He said that form is never more than an extension of content. And I found that phrase a year after I finished my PhD. If I found it a year before, I wouldn't have finished. Because I spent the next 7 years unpacking that. And that's elegantly simple and hugely complicated.
Absolutely. Projective verse.
Yeah,
and that's something should influence the way we write as we interact with these technologies.
So it should. So how does it influence your practice? How have you been changed?
Yeah, enormously. I gave a specific example with the MIT Media Lab stuff that I've done in terms of like reformulating the way that my literature might actually interact with human beings in the cognitive way, in a very fundamental way, in the way people think about language. I am interested in language and the way language is mediated, and I feel like my responsibility, or the wonderful feeling we all described, that we get, the little buzz we get from literature, being placed in the world in a community of humans trying to act ethically, and these things that we do prescribe to literature should be about the writer interacting with the world around them and being fidelitous to that. So my sensitivity to technology is not only just the fundamental environment of what I'm writing, but also the thing I'm reflecting. I'm interested in it for that reason, not in a very literal way, I don't think.
Right, thank you. The point about interactivity, and you and Ed talked about dynamism, it interests me enormously because it seems to me that if we have a digital medium, some form of digital literature, that exists in the network, something very interesting is happening. When you read a novel or a poem, it happens in your head. Yeah. You're there, you're on your own. You animate it all, you make it happen. You are a different person each time, but there's only you there. In a room like this, we interact with each other and we assume the existence of other minds. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that can be debatable, but by and large, it's borne out. When some of the forms of digital literature that I've engaged with, and indeed some forms of online engagement like Twitter, Facebook, whatever, I'm not alone in my head. It's the experience of reading a book, but there are other people there with me. And that strikes me as a very new thing for humanity, and also a completely new thing within which to be a creative individual, within which to try to shape experiences. I mean, does that resonate with any or all of you, and how do we deal with it?
I think for me, it's a really old experience. It's a shared experience of storytelling. It just goes back to campfire for me. And I think some of those really old practices, I come out of theatre, call and response between something that's created and something that comes back and something that changes each night is a very old theatrical device, and why I really encouraged theatre makers to explore this area, because I think there's a lot of expertise already around. It's just about, there are new forms, new formats, so to think about what that means for these amazing creators and the amount of craft that we already can rely on, and the amount of intelligence that we already can rely on, I feel that although I feel we're reinvestigating a lot rather than creating from scratch.
That's a very interesting perspective, thank you.
I absolutely, multiplicity. And the multiplicity of consideration should affect what you write, how you react. I mean, I think so much, for example, a pithy example, but so much of our dialogue about, say, Twitter is negative to do with attention spans. Not that attention spans have changed. Mm-hmm. Maybe they're quicker now. They take smaller pieces of information in more rapidity, but they've got worse because there's a fetishization of the notion of like contemplation, because we don't have it in our world, so we therefore want to value the thing we don't have anymore. I think owning that language, embedding it into the work we're doing, and also the communities we build, it's a beautiful thing. It's very exciting.
And that becomes a commodity on the internet, that one of the ways that the web, the internet is being thought of is that attention is the unit of currency, that the attention of your audience. So comparing, using the book example, when you're in a book, you're immersed, you're part of that story, you're experiencing that, as Bill said quite rightly, in your head. When you read something online, you're distracted, you're doing 15 different things at once. One of the things that really excited me about the iPad when it first came out was that it was a kind of a singular, a mono engagement. You could only do the thing that was on the screen at that time. And I thought that was really interesting as a way of changing the way I read on a computer, the way I enact. But I think what Stephen just said is interesting because it's not getting worried about the fact attention spans have diminished, or that they've gone, or they've changed, or that Susan Greenfield, God bless her soul, gets excited about the changes in our minds. Our minds have changed every generation, but it's what do we do? How do we respond to that? Because that is a given. That is a given about the world, that things have changed from our generation to our parents' generation. And as writers, as creators, we have an opportunity to make work that explores that.
I agree.
Okay. As writers and creators. So how do we then create writers and creators who are able to engage with the capabilities, with the affordances of these technologies? You know, how do we go out to the people who are doing creative writing courses at University of East Anglia or other places whose dream is to publish a novel and persuade them that that might not be the best dream to have in the networked age?
My personal answer, which is not the only answer, but for me it's become very much about cross-disciplinary work. As I said before, I went to an art academy. I've never been a writer. I then worked in film and I worked in theatre. And I've stolen from all of those different mediums to make what I make now. And I think because the form is new, but again, audiences and stories and art and all of that isn't new. I think stealing from each other, working collectively and figuring out who has little keys to what and who's got brilliant ideas, but how to think about certain bits of storytelling, certain bits of dialogue, multiplicity, all of those things. I think that's for me where the key lies. We're inventing new things, but we can rely on each other to actually collectively know quite a lot of this stuff already.
The other thing you do, so I'm repeating what you said already, is you become a vanguard. You become an avant-garde. You bring writers to it, you bring editors to it, you define the future by making the work now. One of the things that I find fascinating about Circumstances work before I joined Circumstances as a director is that 25,000 people have experienced something that we've made. That's 25,000 people across the world who've done something weird, done something that involves public space and audio, done something that involves small speaker boxes, or handled a book that doesn't behave like a book. And you curate your audience. And that's the other thing that technology's allowed us to do, is to speak to an audience more directly. And that kind of unpacks the whole thing about publishing. But
I mean, I teach creative writing at 3 or 4 institutions in small courses. It's about permission. Right. It's about saying to people who have the technology already, I mean, nothing to do with the actual means needs to be given by us. I know nothing as a technologist. People in my classes know far more than me about technology. That's the way it's going. That's why I believe that, not because I want that to be the case. I would love to fetishize a book covered in animal skin. I love books, but they're going to go, so we need to adapt to what we're going to do. They're going to be fetish. No, I love books.
They're going to be fetish objects.
They're going to be fetish objects, and that's not a bad thing. That's a change. The thing that needs to happen, our responsibility, our role, is permission. You need to give people permission to look to the future and not the past, because a lot of young poets getting involved in poetry fundamentally think they have to write like the past to be a poet. They think their identity is built up in a retrograde notion of poetry, not on their language. And I don't mean that in the sense of like their voice, because that's another terrible misnomer, their language.
We also need to be generous. I think as people, if we are in the vanguard, if we are the people who are kind of carving a space and inventing a form as we go along, we have a responsibility, and the people who talk to us have a responsibility and interact with us. I got incredibly down. I got incredibly angry at people I know you shouldn't read below the line in The Guardian, getting snippy about reading comments. No, but this is about David Mitchell's Twitter fiction, The Right Sort. Now, David Mitchell is a novelist. David Mitchell has, I presume, I've never met the man, I think his writing is astonishing. He doesn't need the money. He doesn't need the attention, but he's experimented with the form, and he's created something. And there's a little bit in The Right Sort where he talks about the central character being a 13, 14-year-old kid who is stealing the Valium from his mother's medicine cabinet. And when Mitchell is writing these 140-character little snippets, there are moments in that he absolutely nails it. He absolutely nails why 140 characters works for that piece of fiction. And I think we have a responsibility to be generous to writers who are pushing into that space and guiding them, because actually that's how permission is granted, and that's how people follow, and it becomes more of an emerging form that we recognise.
Okay. I think the idea of permission is a really important one. And if you like, to bring it into the room, because I want to open up the space for questions and comments from all of you. Individuals and organisations, yes? No, I'm not opening up yet. I'm going to come to you in a moment. That was close.
That's good.
That was
Normally
very
it's-
good,
normally it's
though.
silence.
Very
There's
good.
loads.
Last question to them, and then out to you all. And indeed, if anybody's been tweeting anything, please shout out with appropriately. If you're curating a festival, if you're trying to support literature development in any country around the world, if you're doing something interesting, if you have a shtick, a way of doing things that works at the moment, whether it's a group of authors you know and trust, whether it's a particular approach, how do you begin to bring some of the things that we've been talking about now into your space where they can be explored and experienced and where people can learn that they do have permission to do what they want?
I think there's two things that are really important. One is to not start with technology. Just figure out what you want. Because technology has so many, like we're talking about digital, it's so much, there's so many dimensions you can think of, so many things you can do with it. It's overwhelming and it's ludicrous. So think about what it is that you want. What do you want to open up? Do you want the literature to have a bigger dialogue with what's going on around it? Do you want to let audiences in? Do you want to look at process? Do you want to publish differently? All of those things, think about what you want rather than trying to enter the whole. And you can do that by talking, you don't have to do it all in your own head. There's lots of people who know stuff and are interested in things and can point you towards different places. And once you know what you want, then you have a network with so much talent in it. Bring talent together to start to play with it, to fail initially, to play, because play will lead to these beautiful little nuggets that you can build upon as you explore further and further what you want to make. I think as you beautifully demonstrated at the beginning with the key, there is no big key for you to discover. There is no the technology, there is no the way of doing it. It's about exploring the options that will make your network, your community, your literature richer and more exciting and reach further and wider and create more change and have more impact and all of those things.
Yeah, I'm the same. It's a fundament idea. It's the notion that actually you emphasize the human, you emphasize the community, you emphasize the interactivity because of the potentials that we've got with technology, because the specificity of the technology which will change the way we write, certainly not in the hands of writers.
The other thing I think is keep it simple. My favourite analogy at the moment, just because I'm writing about it, is killer bees, actually. And no, seriously, and hybrids. A lot of the things that we're talking about, actually, when you get down to brass tacks, we're talking about a hybrid fiction. We're talking about adding another thing into something. So a story told across Twitter, a story told using technology that's already there, using telephone calls, whatever those things might be. We're making a hybrid. When nature makes a hybrid, it's red in tooth and claw, and it will wipe out species, it will wipe out animals and plant species in order to get something that survives. When we make hybrids, we make them, and when they work, we make them for generally one particular reason. So killer bees, which are real, are African. You know
Not in Norwich, though.
Not in Norwich. Well, I saw a big Africanized honeybees bred with European honeybees to make a breed of bee that produces more honey, and it absolutely works. This breed of bee, this species of bee, produces a lot more honey. The side effect is that they are incredibly aggressive, and then 36 swarms escaped, and now South America has killer bees. But at the heart of it is one idea. You're doing one thing. Don't try and throw the kitchen sink at everything. Don't try and invent the wheel every time. Just do one small thing and move it forward. And it might be about audience. It might be about shifting the way they're writing. It might be about give yourself a stick of charcoal rather than a pencil.
Of course, your stick of charcoal could evolve into a literary form that destroys everything else.
Yeah.
I think is one of the things I've just heard you say there.
You did hear me say that.
The killer bees of literature.
I went to the killer bees into a panel.
So, without wanting to provoke panic or despair, I believe there was a comment here. There's a microphone, and if you could introduce yourself, that would be really helpful. Though if you wish to remain anonymous, you can.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sharmila. Thank you very much. Interesting presentation and comments. I just want to throw two things into the mix, which might make me be accused of being a Luddite. So first of all, I want to say that there is a comment to be made that just because you can do something, it doesn't mean it's progress. And I think that's really important for people to remember. You know, throughout the history of humankind, we've done things that have been not progress at all. So just because, you know, there is some technology out there doesn't mean it's progressing us in any shape or form. And secondly, one night I was going home on the train and there was a very drunken woman asking me why I was reading a book. And she said that she works for a company that was making music to accompany Kindles, so that when you were reading a certain book, you could choose from these however many soundtracks to accompany your book. And I thought, well, what's the point of that? Because I don't want you to impose on me what soundtrack I might want, because my imagination will do that. And if I want to, you know, have, I don't know, Mozart or, you know, whoever doing, you know, that particular day, the next day I might want, you know, Robbie Williams to accompany the same book. And for me,
a world where that would ever happen.
but for me, what that showed was actually there are still gatekeepers with technology. They're the people who are making that technology, the programmers, the people who create the software that we're using. So I think that there still are gatekeepers. They're just changing faces.
Thanks, Shannon. They're both, I think, very good points. Do you want to dive in, Steve?
First point is a philosophical point. It's about how you define progress. If you have like a very specific Western Enlightenment humanistic view of progress, then that's absolutely the case. Progress is just things moving forward in the shape that they do, and that's contingent on chaos. We have no control over that. So the things that have happened might have been awful and good, but they've happened, and that's all I mean by progress. Like, technology is happening because of a feedback loop that no individual controls, i.e. smartphones. Nobody had that. They're popular. There's a market of human interaction with them, and they balloon. We don't control that, but we have to move with it. So it's not a case of like, are we the president or a player, the head of Apple who can control it. That's a real conversation to have someone with that much power. But for us as writers who are responding, it's kind of irrelevant whether or not we think progress is good or bad or one way or another. If we're still alive and things are moving forward, that's what I meant by progress. And the second thing is, the gatekeepers may be on the train that you interact, but if you go on the deep web or you go on 4chan, there's other gatekeepers around or not gatekeepers there. And if you're part of Anonymous, so it depends where you're looking, and that's about your attitude. Not that yours is bad, obviously. You're a lovely person, Shamala, I know you. Your attitude towards technology, and this is the point that I was trying to make. It's about how we perceive it. And if we think technology is this lady writing jingles on the train, which I do sometimes, and we all do, fine. But actually, technology is things so far removed for us in MIT or in Anonymous or Deep Web. That's the place we've got to get our attention to open that up, to democratize that. We have to control it. We have to own it.
So I'm much less vanguardistic than most people on this panel. I'm like a retrograde, really. So I don't like your lady on the train. Because I think it sort of comes back to what we were saying earlier. Is what do we want to do? And actually prescribing what I'm listening to while I'm reading, that's exactly like yours. My response is, thank you, but no thank you. But for me, that points out why it's so important that people in this room engage with this, because otherwise we'll be stuck with the lady who writes jingles for our books. And that's really a future that I don't want. So for me, it's very much, we don't have a responsibility. You can do whatever you want. But I would like to see a future where people like the people in this room and the people in your networks are part of this conversation so that actually something beautiful will happen rather than the most boring, awful, prescriptive stuff.
It's you can imagine sort of E.L. Grey writing the soundtrack to 50 Shades as well as the script for the film.
Phil, I just shuddered. It's horrible. The only thing I want to add, I want to agree with everything everybody said, and I want to agree with exactly what you said, and I just want to... because the reason that I started physically making rather than just thinking and writing and being opinionated about this was that company that made soundtrack, and I thought that was the most ridiculous idea I'd heard in my life. It was the most appalling. I can remember seeing them on the BBC Breakfast sofa. I'd watch it, turn the TV on, and I just went, you're joking. That's technology. That's moving forward. That's something that, and that's one of the reasons I make the work I make. Is to do something.
To make that world not possible.
To make that world not possible. With our jingles, like, if we're open to all art forms and open to all forms of fiction, we're open to jingles. Just don't buy it. Go on deep web.
Let the market choose, or rather, let the people in this room choose. I'm going to come to you, sir, and then to Naomi in the back, though. So if I could... Oh, and then to you, Sam.
firstly, Tom, I found it interesting that you said attention is currency, because if you look at the English language, you pay attention, right? So it's funny that how it works like that. And secondly, technology, a lot of times people are resistant to change. And I think people don't want to change. Like that music thing we're talking about, you necessarily, us, like I'm not interested in there, but I guarantee you there is somebody that will learn through that.
Yeah.
And it's important to have that regardless, right? One example is writing poetry online for me. I'm not a literary poet, I'm more of a spoken word poet. But because of technology, I put my poetry online, and I found out somebody in a refugee camp in Kenya was indulging in my poetry. Now, if I didn't adapt to technology and I was just a literary poet and I wrote on a piece of paper to sell it or to distribute it, I would have never been found, or she would have never been able to relate to that poetry. And so accepting it is fantastic. And not all means there are people on YouTube that I look at and I'm like, what are you doing online? But then they have 35 million subscribers who think that is amazing. So it's a change always scares people, but regardless of what change comes in with the technology, I think we should accept it, because there are other people that learn differently than the way we learn.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's a really important point.
And I guess the point I was making was we started to make this work because the idea that you could merge music and the written word, music and audio, was a given. We just thought there's a much more interesting thing you can do with it.
Does anybody else want to just pick up on this, or shall we go to our next interrogator, who's only mildly intimidating because she knows much more about this sort of stuff than I do?
Oh, we're a little bit intimidated.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
You're going to need to project. The mic's really just for the live stream.
Oh, okay. All right. Hello. Probably a couple of you know what I'm going to say.
Does it begin with B?
Yeah. What would the panel make of the proposition that digital native literature already exists, is in fact tremendously successful, the most enormous entertainment industry in the world, and its name is video games?
Yeah, I'm down with that. There's avant-garde poetry video games. Someone's remixed Bruno Schulz in Poland, and you can choose your way through remaking Bruno Schulz's novels. It's just another interactive interface for poetry or language art to interact with. 100% agree. It doesn't block one out from the other. It's just part of a new tradition.
But do you count? Yeah, come back on us. Come back on us.
No,
and then let the
I
other two
want to
have
answer
a go.
that. It's complete. Naomi, you're completely right. It's video games, and I don't want publishers to think that games are the answer. Gamifying literature, and I don't want to throw any examples in my head, but I've got 4 or 5 that were published in the last 2 or 3 years. I think is really interesting. I think it's a really novel way of engaging, but it's not just the answer. And I think it risks becoming an easy answer for publishers to say, let's make this a game, let's apply a gamified engine to this piece of literature, this story. And I think it's reductive.
Yeah. GTA 8, The Wasteland.
Yeah, or... No, I don't. No, really, I don't.
What's really interesting at this point in time is that genre boundaries are becoming more and more fluid, more and more porous. So while I think there is some amazing video games that I would consider art, and some incredibly rubbish ones that I would consider nowhere near art or literature, anywhere near, it's a format in which beautiful and not so beautiful work is being made. As Tom says, I think it's a very successful one, it's a blockbuster one. I think there are a lot of different unexplored avenues at the moment, which will be equally exciting, some equally successful, some less successful, but I think the exploration is very much at the start. And although yes to some video games being amazing, no to that's where it's all going.
And if you substitute play and experience for video games, I completely agree with you.
Okay, so Naomi, suppose we were here in 1936 talking about the future of literature, and you'd stood up and said, surely there is a really advanced form of literature already. It's called film.
Yeah.
What is the future of theatre? And I would have said, well, theatre is going to continue much as it always has done. It's a marvellous... Oh, sorry, yes. Theatre is a marvellous thing. But if we're looking for what is the new way to use new technologies in the future of theatre, you go, well, film.
But film is not theatre, and maybe video games are not literature in the sense you're trying to use the word.
Yeah. some of them are and some of them aren't. But then, of course, some books are great and some books are terrible. Anyway, I have monopolised this much too long.
No. It's not monopolising, because when there's intelligence in the room, we want to use it. Yeah. But now we're going to go to Sam.
You can do comedy.
Nicely done there, Bill. I'm Sam Ruddock. I love technology and digital kind of things, but I want to provoke a little bit here.
Could you
I want to play the
because I think people
Luddite role.
Can hear
All right.
if you do.
It seems like a lot of the way we've been talking today sort of poses the idea that traditional literary forms are static, that analog kind of books are static, and that digital is dynamic. And I want to raise the idea, we've talked about kind of how interactivity of narratives, but actually there is something that happens to readers when they consume a static text that doesn't happen when you consume an interactive text. Nicholas Carr has done some really interesting research on the neurology of reading.
He's read other people's research.
Yeah, he has. He hasn't
All
done
right.
any research himself.
I don't know enough about the exact science of it. But what he is showing, interestingly, is that what happens in the human brain when you read immersively, concentrate fixedly on one thing, is that, so if you read about kicking a ball, to your brain, you are kicking a ball. If you read about loving thy neighbour, you are in your brain, you are doing that actively. The same parts of your brain flare when you read deeply as when you don't. That doesn't happen when lots of things are happening. So it's not a question of consciousness and kind of the rapidness of moving around, but it's different things happen at different times. And I think we need to get away. Static text can have dynamic impacts, and dynamic text can have static impacts, and it's a broader conversation than just...
I absolutely agree. I've had this same conversation with lots of people in theatre that goes, but theatre is incredibly active. Even if you sit in the dark, you're not just sitting in the dark. And I absolutely agree. What stories do, what literature does, is sparking imagination. It's incredibly active. It's an active act. What we're talking about, I think, on this panel is just, it's syntax. It's the object. So we're talking about it much more literal than you do right now, which is also beautiful and is absolutely true.
I think
no one disagrees with that. Let me put it that way.
I think, does everybody follow, firstly, the argument that Sam is making? Because I think it was eloquently expressed. What I think you've done is you've broadened the frame from what we've been talking about on the panel and put us in a context, which is really quite important. It's like we're up on the top right quadrant of dynamic content and dynamic readers, whereas you're talking about the other three squares there, and they do need to be addressed. Yeah. And we were careful, in a sense, not to define the word digital, to give ourselves enough leeway to go where we felt like we would go. So thank you. I mean, do you want to add to that?
Ask a second question.
I will come to you
at this point, which is the digital debate kind of stuck in terms of digital literature? I feel like I could have sat and had this conversation with these terms that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that what is happening, the digital art that is being created is really, really exciting and innovative, but the language that and the way we talk about it and the context in which we frame discussions about digital literature doesn't seem to move forward to keep space. And I don't know if you could kind of
Sam,
respond to that idea of how do we create a digital narrative kind of language to
if I can be provocative back, it's only been 5 years. Give us time.
Relatively.
And I'm not trying to be glib. Whereas I am being glib. In that time, I think maybe for me, 20, 50 pieces of really interesting digital literature, digital art, digital kind of work that moves the world forward have appeared and lasted and been kind of resonant enough. I'm still talking to students about Gibson and Ashbur's Agrippa, made in 1992. I still talk about Jeff Ryman's 253, made in 1997. I think I'm not worried about the language not having evolved. One of the things that worries me is we're not seeing enough new work. Rather than that, I think the language is fine, the language is adequate. And as new work emerges, we'll find ways to describe it and ways to construct a taxonomy.
Do you want to add anything to this?
Please, no.
I think there is a lot of interesting work being made, and I think I'm practical in that sense. I think what needs to happen is that there needs to be more space and more interconnected space, because lots of these experiments happen away from mainstream dialogue. So I think actually creating more and more space in which it happens, an interconnected space, festivals talking to each other, artists talking to each other, writers talking to makers and technologists. I think that's what's starting to happen more and more. It's becoming, and that interconnection, that networkedness will lead to a language that will evolve around the work as it is created.
Exactly what I was going to say. Yeah, I think that it is actually progressing, but maybe just out of my purview and your purview, because I'm not deep in it. But when I went to the Electronic Literature Festival at Kingston University, way over my head, people so deep in that world, they'd gone 10 miles past me, So I think it's where we're hearing the language and where we're talking.
And of course, events like this are part of the, if you like, that process of acculturation, of getting people who are not perhaps thinking about digital literatures to engage with it for the first time and then see how it gets built into their practice. And that is necessarily a slow process, because if you're a struggling festival or whatever, the last thing you want to do is to break things too soon. So it will just take a long time, I fear, but we need people like you to keep on poking and pushing. Yeah. There was a comment here. No, sorry, I'm afraid. Yeah, you next. And then you, and then you. No, it's...
I think you can give people as much permission and accessibility and technology as possible, but it doesn't make them good writers. And I'm concerned that there's a generation coming up that is focusing more on technology and how to design apps and not taking enough time to actually develop the craft and explore language in language. I mean, a cliche is a cliche is a cliche, no matter if I read it on the page or if it's fired straight into my frontal lobe. So I'm just wondering what your opinion on that. Are you finding there are writers that are skipping the actual groundwork and developing their writing? We're here talking about digital literatures, but it seems all digital and nothing about the actual literature.
We need some new cliches.
You're making the assumption that because the technology is doing those things, that something's happening innately to the literature process. Is that what you're saying?
No, not at all. I'm saying that the actual literature is about words and ideas and connections. You may disagree, that's my personal opinion, but it's actually having something worthwhile saying, something worthwhile sharing.
Yeah.
But unless there's a connection between that technology making people worse, are you suggesting they are getting worse? Because I don't think so. I'm surrounded by thousands of great writers. I don't think there's any detriment to writers.
I think you're right. What's happening is that there is a pool of great writers in the universe, and there's a pool of people willing to explore what narrative is doing. There is a small sliver where that overlaps, and part of my reason to be here is to make that a lot bigger that way towards the good writers, because I think the one thing I'd say is that I want more and more great writers to start thinking about how their work could evolve and become great in other dimensions than the written page. But yes, you're right, and that's what we need to stop, because there is a lot of dross being made at the moment. So
But there's dross in every art.
Yeah.
90% of everything's terrible.
Because it's so young, I think more dross than usual. But yeah.
Briefly, Tom.
Yeah, I think I'm really acutely aware that you're absolutely right. One of the things that we did when we made these pages for Like Ash, and the work we're making now that will be published next year, is work with writers and workshop with writers and get writers into that space and show them what we can do, show them the little bits of technology, because the danger is absolutely that circumstance gets caught up in the technology, in the platform, in the whole thing, and we forget about telling a good story or making a moment. And we're really, this sounds like a mission statement, we're really committed to working with writers. And so anybody who wants to work with us, just find me.
Okay, we have a point here.
Yeah, I'm Flavia from Argentina, and I should begin by saying that I facilitate a reading group on Facebook. That is, I truly adore everything you're saying about technology. But coming from where I come and reading what I have read, and there are some things that probably it's politically incorrect what I'm going to say, but anyway, I'm going to say it. But don't you think it's a kind of a new way of colonization, of cultural colonization? Because, for example, I come from a place where a huge amount of people in my country have no access to internet, have no access to books. And I'm sure I'm speaking for several countries around the world. And it's like everything we are getting is in English, and it comes from the north. So how do you see, for example, we have intertextuality, right? Is this idea of contesting or responding to the center 100 years later by writing or rewriting classics from Europe And I see ourselves, like in South America, for example, starting to write blogs and interactive or creative electronic writing in 100 years' time. Well, probably you will dropped it and come back from to chalk. How do you see that? How do you see that globally? Because, you know, you are here in the center where everything is taking place. How do you see that around the world? Do you see that at all?
I don't think...
Given that the internet should have no centre, is that something we can correct?
I think we can correct it, and I think we've made work internationally. We've made work in China, we've made work in South America, we've made work all over the place, and we use local writers where we can, we use local translators, we try and make the transmission of that as appropriate, as native, as kind of feeling that it's in your language, that we're making it as a response to your city or your place, as we possibly can. But I think it's a huge issue, and I think the fact that I am white, I'm British, I live in the UK, Duncan lives in Brussels, is a problem. We're very aware of it. I'm not sure what the answer is.
I try and program all the time when I work in Mexico and work in these different places, you know, to get people to use their languages. Even when I was in Mexico, I did some of the collaborations with Nahuatl poets, you know, let alone Spanish. They don't want to use it. They want to use English. The difference between colonialism and what's happening with technology is there was a specific colonializing mentality of human beings behind colonialism, where technology, while it is run by individuals to a certain extent, it's open, it's up to people what they do. If people wanted just to write in Spanish in Argentina, they would, but they don't. They want to write in English.
But it isn't the problem in the sense that you're coming in after the technology has done the damage to their view of the world.
No one would read you.
Yes. Yeah. Do you want to make a comment on that? You don't have to.
I think it's really, really interesting, because I do think and again, I think the answers aren't there yet. I don't have them, so sorry. But I think what's really interesting is that that technology does offer the possibility to create networks that can be sustained in a way that it used to be really hard. People would come in and go out. Much more sustained development internationally is possible now. I'd be really interested to explore how we do that, how we create a project that works literally with writers across the world simultaneously, and what that might look like. Because I think that there is a future that transcends some of these things for it. It's just, it hasn't been properly developed yet. But yes to that path.
And more than writers, audiences in different countries actually, you know, engaging. This isn't just about a writer having privilege over the text.
I think, Flavia, you have sort of raised what is actually a very substantial issue about the whole access to digital technology, which we sort of skirted around in our conversation, but deserves deeper analysis, so thank you for that. And I'm going to move on to what may well be our last question.
I'm Cortina Butler, I'm from British Council. Do you think... Sorry.
For the room.
Cortina Butler from British Council. Do you think that those who are engaging with digital are guilty, sometimes, often, maybe, of obfuscation, of making it seem more magical, complex, difficult, not difficult, transformational than it actually is? You know, there's been certain remarks about, well, a novel is something of the past. In the end, from the earliest sort of cave paintings through the Egyptians, through the Bible, essentially what we create is a narrative. It may at some point be dynamic, but as I experience it becomes a static, it still becomes a fixed narrative. That's what we're doing, but we're using different tools. But the digitals are trying to make it sound like it's something different.
So, final question to all of you, then. Are we just a bunch of self-aggrandizing technophiles?
God, yes, of course we are. I think you're absolutely right, and I think part of it comes down to education about what a computer can do and what digital technology can do. One of the things that Bill's skirted around a lot in this conversation is trying not to define what digital is. We're talking about something that, as Stephen said, is a fundament, is the air we breathe, is the environment around us. And I think that's actually where it gets complicated. It's not complicated. It's really simple. You often need someone who knows what they're doing. The same as a writer needs a publisher needs an editor and the editorial voice to make that thing visible.
The death of the novel was claimed long before technology came up. It depends what you mean by a novel. If you mean a book, it's very different than if you mean a sustained piece of language that you put on the page. And the notion of a narrative, maybe that word has been used a few times in a way that I take it to mean something else, like a Rothko painting's not a narrative. art is not a narrative, it's an expression of us in the world. Technology is just changing the environment in which we enter in, and all things have, as they race forward at such pace, the feeling of being obfuscated from us if we don't know. But I think that my response, and this is the last thing I'll say, just from my perspective, not a technologist, not a scientist, I'm not pushing this idea forward. It's taken me years to really think very hard about what this means for my practice as being a page poet, someone who's published books and is interested in actually very retrograde notions of literature. I have to admit to myself, I just want to be interested in the future, and I don't think we could possibly look around the world around us when 10 years ago we literally didn't have almost any of the stuff that we spend half of our day doing and suggest that this might be some sort of mystique.
I think I completely agree with you and maybe disagree with the interpretation. I would put it very much in the cave painting, stories around the campfire, printing press, digital trajectory. It's still the same, but it's also different. A cave painting is different from a printed novel, and it has different qualities, different ways of communicating. It's still it comes from the same impulse. You know, the impulse is universal, is human, is there. There's just, we can do it slightly differently now, and a lot of the rest of the world is happening slightly differently now. So I think thinking about that, thinking about how we develop our practice to reflect that, to take advantage of the opportunities that are in front of us, and to actively play and explore with what this means and how that impulse can be translated now. I think that's what remains true, and that's what's changing simultaneously.
Thank you, Annette. I think that's all we have time for now, so we're going to wrap up. I hope that we've helped you consider which things may be the same and which things may be different as we try to engage with digital literatures. That with Tom Aber, Annette Meese and Steve Fowler, we managed to draw some lines which can then be erased over time. So thank you for coming, thank you for watching, thank you to the panel.